All right.
Okay,
Whenever
I
a
guess we
format
can
is
start
ready.
now.
Hi, I hope I'm audible.
Yeah, you're audible.
Okay, great. Okay, going to start in 3, 2, 1. Pano, we live for a world where everybody does anything and everything that makes them feel happy, right? Which means that anything that brings them the subjective happiness that they crave for is something that we stand for. Which means that if a person wants to go ahead and dine in that fine, luxurious restaurant, if they want to go to a spa, if they want to get a Starbucks, like every break that they have, if they want to go to that salon, if they feel that shopping gives them happiness, we think that's absolutely fine, right? We're absolutely okay. In fact, encourage people to do what they feel gets them happiness, right? We think that the stigma on a certain kind of happiness is problematic because it places a value judgment on what you should do to be happy and what you shouldn't do to be happy. We think that's problematic because it leaves out a large chunk of people who were doing things that did bring them some kind of happiness, right? We think a hedonistic lifestyle shouldn't be stigmatized or actively discouraged because it brings people happiness, and happiness is something that we strive for, right? But what does the stigma look like, right? We think that, look, because stigma doesn't work in retrospect, opposition can't come here and say that they only attack those who waste away their lives, right? Which would This stigmatization means that you're attacking anyone and everyone who you feel is prioritizing pleasure over work and other things that you think should be prioritized because that is more productive, right? Which means that you're attacking them for doing so and you're making them feel bad for doing that, right? Which means you're actively discouraging people from prioritizing themselves over the obligation that they somehow owe to society, and actively making them feel bad that they chose certain things over the other, right? What does the stigmatization then do? We think it leads to deprioritization of things like self-care, and indulging in things that genuinely make you happy, even if they're slightly more expensive, right? But look, what are the things that I'm going to do in this debate? First, I'm going to give you some harms that this stigma brings. And next, I'm going to paint you a picture of what our world really looks like without the stigma, right? First, we think that it deprioritizes self care. Why is that problematic? Look, we think that most people literally spend 12 to 14 hours in the office in a single day, right? They're tired to the bone, they're absolutely burned out. It becomes increasingly difficult for them to go ahead and cope with this kind of stress, right? It's incessantly draining, and it becomes hard for them to really go ahead and find meaning in the things they do because it's that draining, right? We think at that point of time, it also becomes easier to exploit workers and things like that when you don't go ahead and bring this notion of taking breaks or doing something that genuinely makes you feel happy should be prioritized. Which means it also makes it easier for people to ignore issues that don't go ahead and necessarily bring about monetary gains, right? Because the idea is this: stigmatization would then mean that anything that you do apart from your work or capitalistic gains is bad. Which means if you go ahead, take a break, go to like a Starbucks and get a coffee, that's necessarily bad because, oh, you should have been working, and oh my god, spending so much on a Starbucks coffee, that's not allowed. You're not allowed to take a break, right? We think it necessarily puts people in in a complete cycle of continuously remaining in the same rut of working day and night and not taking any time off for themselves. It takes a toll on their mental as well as their physical health, right? But second, this is on hierarchy of needs, right? And this is something that I want to necessarily point to you, because look, people do understand that self-preservation is their priority, right? It's not like they're going to go ahead and waste away their entire lives and not think rationally about the things that they really need, right? Because the idea is this: people are rational, and they won't succumb to the extent that they're going to be absolutely ruined, financially ruined, and they're going to like live pathetic lives, right? The idea is this: your hierarchy of needs is quite fluid, right? Which means you don't need stigmatization as a check balance for you to go ahead and stop beyond a certain point. What does this mean? If I blow up my bank balance on too much shopping, it means, and I don't have enough money, I will still go ahead and be forced to work. I will still have to go ahead and do something and get employment and cut down on the things I spend upon and save a little bit, because I realize that I can't live my life in ruins. This check mechanism already exists. But the point at which you stigmatize the entire lifestyle, it necessarily means that you're also stigmatizing and attacking those individuals who are doing these activities to feel good about themselves and things like that, right? The idea is this. Um, Thirdly, on how you make people feel bad about the breaks that they take, right? Look, what you now start doing is you start looking down upon certain kind of things which bring some people pleasure, right? That's problematic because you're necessarily alienating one section of society, and you're necessarily passing a value judgment on what you think was good, what you think these people should have done, even when that's not necessarily the truth, right? Which means if I do want to go ahead one day and get my like nails manicured, and the next day I want to go and get a haircut, I'm necessarily going to be looked down upon, even if this means this was a way of me taking a break from my extremely hectic lifestyle, simply because some people in society think that that I shouldn't be indulging in things like this. When you deprioritize self-care, you're also making people feel as if they don't belong, or as if they're not worth or deserving of some breaks or deserving of some me time for themselves, right? Happiness is subjective, and we think that that happiness needs to be valued at any given point of time. But look, what does our world really look like, right? We think that there are two kinds of people in absence of the stigma. First are the kind of people who really make a living out of this kind of lifestyle. Look at all these fashion bloggers, etc. For example, right? They're literally entrepreneurs who make a living, who make a career out of this kind of lifestyle, right? Who literally put their content out there for the love for things like this, for the love for fashion, and inspire so many people to go ahead and live their best life. We think that kind of influence is required, because then people get inspired to really do things for themselves. Within the point at which you stigmatize YouTubers, or I don't know, even like celebrity influencers, things like that, it necessarily means that you're also putting down the idea that you can't do some things even if they bring you happiness, if they're beyond a certain threshold. We think your happiness needs to be prioritized. But what's the second thing, a second kind of people in our world, right? Look, we think there are also going to be people who probably don't make or monetize on this kind of like lifestyle necessarily, right? But like the idea is this: it still doesn't bring about any sort of net harm, right? Because you do realize that you don't have to do things beyond a certain extent if it means that it's going to leave you in a financial ruin. So sure, you're going to go ahead and indulge a little more than other people in society, but that doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to absolutely live in shambles. We think at that point of time, when there's literally no net harm to society, when you're not actively going ahead and doing something that's going to harm somebody else, and you're just doing things for yourself, we think there's literally no reason to stigmatize this kind of lifestyle. At the end of the day, what we tell you is that self-care needs to be prioritized. Subjective happiness needs to be given importance. The point at which there's no net harm of this, we think you should vote for this motion. We're very proud to propose.
Thank you for that speech. First negative whenever you're ready.
Hello, can I be heard? Hello, can I be heard?
Yeah, you're audible.
Okay, wait. Okay. Is it okay if I get signals if it's already time? Sorry, I can't use my timer right now.
Would one of the other panelists be okay with doing that? Because I'm using Zoom on my phone, so it would be quite inconvenient.
Yeah, I can do 1, 6, and 8.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Our society is plagued with various issues, and it is high time that we recalibrate the way we perceive societal actions that impact the collective good. Things like going out to dine out despite announcements to stay at home, given that we are experiencing a pandemic, or buying 3 or more designer clothes or bags when one is already enough in status quo, right? I'm gonna prove to you why hedonistic lifestyle is worthy of stigmatization, especially how it hampers the collective good of people and how it necessarily creates more harm in terms of how we have relationship and dynamics in society. But let's ask, right? Let's talk about hedonistic lifestyle because we have to understand that this lifestyle is already the barometer under which the idea of pleasure generating action is perceived in status quo. We recognize that there are laws to be able to limit the actions of people, but we have to consider in today's debate that there are actions beyond those laws that are parallel to the idea of hedonistic lifestyle, such as, for example, overconsumption of food to be able to satisfy our pleasure despite people experiencing world hunger, or buying luxury and other excesses amid overproduction that necessarily harms workers across different nations, right? Especially in this time, we have to be able to recalibrate under which lifestyle we promote the status quo. Because the stigmatization of hedonistic lifestyle is the promotion of life that should be better for humanity, especially when we are facing a crisis. We say it's only perfect that we deprioritize ourselves or we deprioritize uh, the way under which we seek personal pleasure, right? But 2 points of rebuttals from the previous speaker. They said about this thing about self-care, right? We think number one, this is a flawed characterization of what hedonistic lifestyle is ought to be. Because if you take a look at it, self-care is different from self-care that necessarily hampers other individuals in status quo. Because if they're trying to say that we need to be able to prioritize our mental health, we agree. That's why we have interventions in terms of state policies, for example, or healthcare subsidies that necessarily allow us to better our mental health or our mental well-being. But we have to understand that even in status quo, there exist bare minimum standards of self-care that do not necessarily hamper the life of other individuals, such as talking to your friends or using journal, for example, to express your stress, for example, or manage your anger, or listening to music and other some forms of pleasurable things in status quo that also leads to the pleasure of other people, such as because your pleasure of listening to music or watching films also benefit other individuals if you take a look at it. The difference is that under our side, we try to limit the excesses that people have because hedonism is the excessive need for pleasure above any other things above that person at the end of the day. But then they said that we need to be able to prioritize ourselves. We think that the deprioritization of the self is not problematic because when we choose to deprioritize ourselves, we are able to think of the collective. In fact, things like going to spa are only secondary over the people who are really suffering and in need of our attention and need of our help. People who are impoverished, people who lost their jobs in status quo. Because if you look at it, you will never be able to maximize that pleasure under affirmatives model when you have the guilt that you are consuming something at the expense of other people's pleasure, and it's something that's really problematic. And we do not want that world to exist. Let me talk about this idea of moral responsibility in terms of stigmatization of hedonistic lifestyle. Because in principle, we have to recognize that we have a moral responsibility to others, given that we exist in a collective lifestyle where lives of people are intertwined in status quo, right? Because as members of society, we rely on other people too, regardless if these are direct actions or indirect actions. We say that no man is an island, given that a lot of the benefits we reap in status quo are also come from others, also come from people in the past, or also come from the people who sacrifice themselves for us. And we say we have to be able to understand them as well and rationalize that the actions that we have can be also affecting other individuals. So, what does stigmatization entail then? It functions so that people do not deviate from the normative standards, such as the reason why taboos on sexual relations to family and animals exist in the first place, because we recognize that they can be harmful to the societal stability that we posit. And with that, this is parallel to the idea of stigmatizing hedonistic lifestyles, as it necessarily hampers as well the stability of individuals given the present context that we have. So when we talk about stigmatization, what we tell you coming from our side is that these are things that people should not follow suit. People should not strive to do so. People shouldn't be selfish, shouldn't be self-interested over the actions that they have in status quo, right? So we do not want people pursuing pleasure above all else, but rather we want people to realize that there are bigger circles and spaces outside them. So we do things like ingraining guilt for the act of taking pleasure, for example, or we bog the consciousness of people in authority who dictates the lifestyle of other people that can be problematic in status quo. And this is where the idea of collective consciousness comes in. Because under our side, we have to recognize that we have limited resources and only a few individuals can pursue pleasure at the expense of other people. So if you take a look at it, let's ask, who are the people who are allowed to take or to consume pleasure or experience pleasure in the first place? These are people who are already privileged, who are rich, who have the enough capital excesses to be able to pursue that pleasure in the first place. And we think that's problematic because the moment you are consuming that pleasure, it comes at the suffering of other individuals. It is the expense of other people who are unable to experience that pleasure. So under your side, you only heighten the social inequality that exists. And I have structural reasons to prove this. If you take a look at it, right? Right now we're experiencing a lot of we are experiencing a lot of problems, such as things like climate change, for example. And the problematic reason as to why this exists, it is because rooted on the idea that we need to be able to consume and produce at the expense of other people. It is rooted from the idea that there are limited resources in status quo, and thus the action to be done is to limit the excesses that people have. Because if you take a look at it, we peddle the narrative of a cosmopolitan and consumeristic lifestyle under which corporations are able to produce more and more goods and condition the lifestyle of people to be able to do so, such as buying designer clothes, buying a lot of goods, a lot of clothes, for example, that led to fast fashion and the problems of climate change, for example, or the pleasure of animal hunting that leads to the degradation of the ecosystem that we have in status quo, right? So this necessarily amalgamates to a bigger problem that the collective experiences in status quo. Because when corporations and at the same time personal individuals search for gratification, search for pleasure, it is where the problem happens. And this can be parallel to the idea of the tragedy of the commons, where people necessarily consume more and more simply because they want to experience more and more pleasure under our side. So parallel examples to this are increasing our carbon emission because we want to go to vacations, for example, or we want to ride private cars over mass transportation in status quo. So what's the point? The point is to say that with the stigmatization of hedonistic lifestyle, number one, we limit the mobility of people, especially when these actions significantly hamper the society and significantly impact the lives of individuals to begin with. But secondly, it's also putting a stop or putting a cap on the people's action to make them rationalize and realize that their actions can also lead to the detriments of other individuals. And it is only when they are able to realize that their hedonistic lifestyle can significantly impact the lives of other people that we put a stop over these things and people try to recalibrate their actions that they can help other individuals. So the converse under our side is that number one, we reduce material wealth, especially the overconsumption and overproductions of commodities or luxury bags or designer shoes, for example. But secondly, we encourage people to be able to live within the material wealth that they already have. So they wouldn't have to buy more and more, for example, with just the idea that we want to experience pleasure. But thirdly, we decrease the consumeristic lifestyle of people. That is again rooted on the idea that they need to buy, that they need to shop in order to experience pleasure in the first place. The conclusion to this is simple. We say that pleasure is corrupting in status quo, and we need to ask the question, when do we necessarily stop? That can only happen when we that can only happen in a world where we stigmatize the idea of hedonistic lifestyle, right? So again, the idea of people suffering are rooted from privileged individuals and rich individuals who try to consume and try to seek for more pleasure at the expense of other individuals, right? We say individual actions significantly impact the collective, and the detrimental impacts of that actions is not individualized. Rather, it is expanded to the collective, to the community that we have in status quo. So therefore, what we would say is that it is high time that we recalibrate the actions that people take. But secondly, it is high time that the stigmatization of hedonistic lifestyle be placed in society to be able to limit the actions that and limit the mobility of people that significantly hampers other individuals. And lastly, we say that the stigmatization of hedonistic lifestyle is what makes them rationalize and realize that there are bigger social circles and there are bigger social spaces that we ought to help other individuals, given that we face massive problems and massive issues in status quo. I've never been prouder to oppose.
Thank you for that speech. I welcome the second speaker from side affirmative to continue the debate.
Hi, if it's all right, we'll be doing a swap. So Kevin, like I'll be going deputy, if that's okay with the panel and the other team.
Is that okay with the other panelists?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, sure. I don't think that's against the rules or anything.
Yeah,
Okay.
just confirming. All right, go ahead.
Sure, just give me 10 seconds. I'll be timing myself. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Someone's mic is on. I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Side negative runs on a rather intuitive premise that we as a society should be stopping these actions that are bad to society, and we have to regulate these, and every single individual has a moral obligation to abide by this. The question we must ask ourselves while adjudicating this debate is that one, is that all that stigmatization does? Are there any other negative impacts that stigmatization can bring about? And secondly, is this the only exclusive way in which you can bring this about? So our metric of regretting is simple. We believe that stigmatization causes way too many harms for people, and it does more than it is supposed to do. And all their ideas of social moral obligations and regulating bad actions can happen better off on our side without creating these harms. Firstly, on the question of is this all that stigmatization does? Do our harms really stand? And there was no response from their end in terms of how we told you as to how stigmatization necessarily deprioritize self-care. The idea is this: since stigmatization of a lifestyle cannot happen in retrospect, you necessarily go ahead and attack every single aspect of a person's life that matches with the definition of hedonism. Hedonism means that you're prioritizing your pleasure over all else, which necessarily means that if you see a person, the societal idea of stigmatizing necessarily means that when you look at a person who is prioritizing the pleasure over the obligation that they owe to society vis-a-vis the capitalistic working places or vis-a-vis whatever the social obligation that they mentioned, you go ahead and attack them. It necessarily means that you're not only attacking those people who are overspending money on buying luxurious brands or all those things, but you're also critiquing and attacking people and making those people feel bad for taking breaks from their work.
Sorry, excuse me, guys. Our teammate has bad internet. Can we turn off video because they said it's very choppy? If that's fine.
So should I turn off my video, or are you talking about you guys turning off your video?
You guys, because it's choppy.
Okay. Should I restart my speech? Because I don't
I
remember
think
where I
it's.
was. It like sort
I
of
think
broke
it's
my
fine
flow.
if we just
was your-
continue from.
Was your teammate able to hear parts of the speech enough to understand what was happening?
Maybe around like 30 seconds. We push back.
Should I just restart then? Because I think I've also lost my flow.
If that's fine,
Um,
maybe that's better.
Yeah, depending upon the
I
time. Because
just.
Only if negative team has not heard most of the first 1.5 minutes, then we can restart. So that depends on you, negative team. Have you heard most of the speech or not?
We heard some, but since second half said that they lost the flow, then I think we can just restart.
All right, let's go with restarting the speech then. Whenever you're ready.
We're
Okay,
so
I'll just-
sorry for this.
Yeah, that's okay. I'll just switch off my video, and that's called the issue, right?
Yes.
Yeah, video.
Cool,
Thank
cool.
you.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
yeah, no issues. Yeah. Okay, starting in three, two, one. Side negative runs on a very intuitive premise that you need to stop certain bad actions that happen in society, and you need to deprioritize these things that always go ahead and detrimentally impact the less fortunate. And we must always live with this idea of a moral obligation. The question that we must ask ourselves while adjudicating this debate is, firstly, does stigmatization only do these things such as imposing a moral obligation, or does it go one step further and also create other harms? And secondarily, is stigmatization of a hedonistic lifestyle the only way of bringing about these good changes as side negatives seeks to achieve on their side house? Going on the first question in terms of what happens when you stigmatize, I think they ignored a large chunk of our analysis in terms of when we explained to you that since stigmatization does not happen in retrospect, you would necessarily go ahead and attack all these actions that necessarily match the definition of a hedonistic lifestyle. You as a society look down upon those people who are prioritizing their self-care, their luxury, and always prioritizing their consumption and their pursuit of happiness over those obligations that they owe to society. These obligations could be one societal in nature, but also capitalistic in nature, which necessarily means that all of our harms in terms of talking about you deprioritizing taking breaks, you deprioritizing taking a step back from your work and taking an off day also stand, because necessarily these people are looked down upon for not living up to the obligation, because society, as you as a society, are regretting this idea of a hedonistic lifestyle. Since you can't regret an entire lifestyle in retrospect, you're necessarily going to proactively regret any singular action that matches the definition. The second question then is in terms of how do you want to regulate these actions? Because I negative believe that the only way to regulate this action is to always give this impending doom of moral obligation upon every single individual. Let's break these premises. There are three ideas under this idea of an obligation. Firstly, they say that pleasure always comes at the cost of others. I'm actually unsure why that works in the practical world, because we are debating real life. So necessarily when I, living in America, stop consuming food, it doesn't mean that the food that I don't consume goes to Africa, because that's a rather unintuitive and ridiculous principle to run upon. If the idea is that you want to encourage people to necessarily go ahead and work and campaign for changes and structural changes, that you redirect the distribution of funds and you redirect resources from America to Africa, that can only happen on our side. Why is that so? Necessarily because in a world where you stigmatize hedonistic lifestyle, you stigmatize every single person who deviates from the norm of doing their jobs and putting their head down and goes towards prioritizing other things and other societal norms. When you stigmatize the idea that hedonistic lifestyle is bad, you also go ahead and stigmatize this idea that anyone who doesn't conform to the societal expectations of capitalistic productivity is bad. This deprioritizes people from looking at things beyond their jobs, looking at things beyond their social circles, and looking at things in the outside world. It necessarily means that the comparative then is in terms of which side can guarantee you better change. At best, side negative just ensure that one American dude doesn't eat an extra burger, but that doesn't result in translate into any benefits or towards the less fortunate in the world. But on our side of the house, when you encourage people to look beyond their jobs, to look beyond their obligations, and do what they feel can derive them happiness and look for their pleasure, it necessarily means that people can also go ahead and stand up for these societal issues and campaign for change on their side of the house. The premise that they run upon is that when you prioritize self pleasure is always selfish in nature, and that's rather untrue, because the idea is this: pleasure means whatever gives me happiness and whatever I derive happiness upon. That necessarily means that the premise in terms of saying that pleasure always comes at the cost of others is untrue, because you are quantifying pleasure to say that there's only a finite number of pleasure that exists in the world, and once you take away something, someone else can't access that idea of pleasure. But we believe that pleasure is individualistic and subjective in nature, which necessarily means that every single person's idea of pleasure is different. If I as a person seek pleasure in consuming more amount of things, I'm free to do so. But the idea is this: if you want people to change society, society can change only when governments are incentivized to do this, and when governments actually work upon the redistribution of funds. Imposing upon this idea of moral guilt upon innocent individuals by saying that because you're eating this burger, some kid in Africa is dying, is not going to solve any problems from their side, and that's rather untrue for them to say in terms of this idea. The second thing that they said in this speech is the idea of climate change, that we want corporations to stop producing these things because you're encouraging hedonistic lifestyle. That's untrue, because if you look at it from the perspective of a corporation, they are not producing these things or destroying the environment because they find pleasure in it. They do so because there is self-sustenance involved in it, which necessarily means that even on their side of the house, when you stigmatize this idea of a hedonistic lifestyle, corporations will still be going out and carrying out practices that are detrimental for the impact of an environment and are bad for the environment, which necessarily means that your idea of stigmatization does not really stop these corporations, does not stop these people people from polluting and stuff like that. And then it goes on and harms and detrimentally impacts those people who are just want to consume or prioritize their happiness, which means it's not a fair enough trade-off to make. If you want to live in a world where corporations are not polluting the environment, you will need to have stronger environmental regulations and stuff like that come from this idea of where governments take up responsibility, and not from this idea of where people are imposed with the idea that you should never prioritize your pleasure over anything else. And we feel the likelihood of individuals deprioritizing their jobs, deprioritizing their capitalistic obligations, and going towards these sort of protests and marching for the environment can only happen in our world. But because on their world, what necessarily happens is when you stigmatize anything apart from your capitalistic and corporate job frames, you deprioritize all of these actions, which means on a comparative, if the comparative were to, in which side can you bring more climate change or more rights for the minorities, that's likely to happen on our side. But what is the real comparative? Because they feel that, and let's be practical, because they say that what happens is that when you don't stigmatize hedonistic lifestyles, people go out during the pandemics. Look, the idea then is this: is stigmatization the only exclusive way to bring about this sort of action where you prevent people from going out during the pandemic? That's untrue, because we have seen how there are laws and regulations that always come into play that arrest people for doing so, that always penalizes them for doing so when you find them. We don't think you need to stigmatize an entire lifestyle to necessarily go ahead and do this. The comparative is simple panel in this question: if all the benefits that they want to achieve is inexclusive at best, and the harm that we propose to you are exclusive and can't be solved or eradicated about, we stand to this debate on a comparative, right? What were the harms that we spoke to you about in terms of a world that we live in? We think the world that we live in stigmatizes hedonistic lifestyles to an extent where it doesn't allow people to look beyond their job frames, doesn't allow people to do anything beyond that, and prioritize the self-pleasure and prioritize things that they want to do. The idea is this, and this is why opposition as of now is wrong, because they're saying pleasure always comes at the cost of someone else. They have to prove that link to you as to why always me practicing my pleasure is going to harm someone else, because our premise is rather different. We believe that your pleasure is not always at the cost of someone else, and if your pleasure always comes at a detrimental cost to some other individual's life or right to life, as a society you have the ability to cram down upon it by the ways of laws and regulations. You don't need to have a societal narrative that regrets this sort of lifestyle, because it does far more than just simply regulate certain actions like a Karen going out during the pandemic and having food in a restaurant. It does far more than that. Necessarily, then the comparative is in terms of the harms that we propose to. So the first question with regards to harm is: does a world ever regulate a slippery slope in terms of how does a world have people will always be prioritizing the pleasure and always be harming society? We told you that's not true. Why is that so? Because for two reasons. One, people are rational human beings. Self-sustenance is always important, which necessarily means that if people feel that me consuming and destroying the environment is going to harm my way of is the only way in which I derive pleasure, they also realize that this also means that they're cutting off ear from their life and they're destroying their quality of life. Which means on a comparative, you always have intuitional self-checking mechanism where you always prioritize your self-sustenance over this normative idea of pleasure. It means that you don't need to have a societal narrative that restricts people from doing things like taking breaks, because people intuitively have stuff that stop them from making those choices that harm them and harm society, because they feel that is true, because self-sustenance dictates that. The second thing is the idea under the question of is there a slippery slope, is that the idea is that human beings have a fluid hierarchy of needs. It means that what happens on their world is that you solidify this hierarchy of needs, that you always have to prioritize society and you can never prioritize yourself, which means the harm or idea that you are never encouraged to take breaks, you're never encouraged to take stuff like self-care necessarily stands, because you're not allowed to have a fluid hierarchy of needs. On our world, when you have a fluid hierarchy of needs, you will always prioritize pleasure to the extent where you derive happiness out of it. But when it goes ahead and detrimentally impacts your life or the quality of life of the people around you, you will always have a self-check mechanism to stop it, because you always prioritize this idea of living a better life, which means that you will not go ahead and waste all your money into buying designer clothes and stuff like that, because you realize that once you don't have any money, your life is bad. That means you always have that intuitive self-checking mechanism. The benefits on our world far outweigh any of the harms that they try to propose. We told you the benefits that we live in a world where people are able to prioritize themselves, people are able to take care of their mental health, people are able to better live lives where they don't have to kill themselves or burn themselves out just for their cooperative goals. This debate is not about which world can solve climate change, because that can happen irrespective of this notion of stigma existing. That can happen when society is forced to take action, that can happen when governments take these actions. We don't think people need to do that. And even if that is the question, I've proven to you why it's likely to happen on our side. Very, very proud to propose.
Thank you for that speech. I welcome the second speaker from side negative to continue the debate.
Hi, I just want to ask if I can be heard. Hello?
Yeah, you're audible.
There was some disturbance in your background. I just heard some car or something.
Yeah, because I'm outside. But like, does it prevent you from like hearing the rest of my speech? Or anyway.
Yeah, I think it's clear. Your speech is clear.
Okay, great. All right, let me start in 3, 2, 1. we need to clarify what hedonism is, because I don't think that the previous speakers from Affirmative Bench did understand that. We don't think that hedonism or the stigmatization of hedonism exists on self-pleasure and, just people wanting to have manicures, people wanting to have facials, people wanting to go to spas. Obviously, on our side, we need to be realistic. Stigmatization exists when personal pleasure comes in conflict with common good. Because what we would say on our side is no one stigmatizes people pursuing the self if it does not harm anybody. That is why we don't call out people who get manicures and pedicures, because it does not create any big negative externality to others. What we said on our side is we need to look at the greater scheme of things, right? So some individuals believe that the ability to pursue the self ought to take primacy over others. What this looks like, ladies and gentlemen, are people who could have chosen to walk to go to a nearby place but chose not to because it is inconvenient for them and does not give them pleasure, even if it creates massive carbon emissions to the environment that as an aggregate we say can potentially create more harms to common good. So this is the type of things and narratives that people likely stigmatize. Nothing normal like pursuit to take care of the self. We don't think that's where the debate lies. But if that's the case, the question on your side is, how do you start calling out the excesses? Because I'm not so sure how you deal with that on your side. You talked about things like laws, etc., etc. So if I prove on our side that strengthening laws and the ability of laws to be legitimate over people exists when society is willing to embrace that because they're willing to see their personal individual interests to the greater collective, then you have nothing to stand on coming from your side. So let's try to compare the harms that the previous speaker decided to talk about. They said you will be shamed for self-care and things like that. So what we said on our side of the house is be comparative, right? So we say the harms that are probably going to extend to an individual is you get shamed for excessively spending on skincare, you get shamed for excessively buying bags and things like that. But on our side, the harm, ladies and gentlemen, that exists on the greater society is people not getting access to goods and services because some individuals are able to pursue self-interest to the point that resources that are massively scarce in society only go to those who have the ability to access them. We said on our side of the house, the world is facing multiple crises and multiple problems, right? And we need more individuals who are willing to lend a helping hand to the greater society and not just to whatever gives them greater pleasure. Then they told us on their side, people work nonstop, and this is bad because now they're starting to get exploited. Look at why people are working nonstop is because their bosses tell them that profits are more important, that productivity is more important. So on our side, you can conclusively presume that it's the same hedonistic lifestyle that bosses have, the ability to pursue greater wealth, that pushes other people to the edge and makes them work nonstop. So what we would say from our side is it is precisely that hedonistic lifestyle that pushes people to that particular edge because you have to understand the power dynamics of the actions involved. Most of the time, it is the rich individuals who have more control over society who also have the same hedonistic lifestyles in their lives. So what we would propose from our side is individuals who are smaller, the poor and middle class, are under the whims of the hedonistic people in society, and then they suffer more. But if you look at it, hedonism is not the antithesis of exploitation. To solve exploitation, ladies and gentlemen, you need to invoke things like humanity and understanding that other people are not means to your personal ends, but are individuals that you need to recognize as individuals who are rational and autonomous that have to be respected. So no, it's a fictional dichotomy for them to say that the opposite of exploitation is hedonism. We just need to treat people better on our side and not exploit them. Lastly, he said on their side, people are rational and they won't harm the environment and society. If you look at it, ladies and gentlemen, this isn't the case because most of the time, people who have the choice to do actions that pursue self-interest at the expense of the greater society are people with the option to insulate themselves from harm. These are individuals with the money to be able to protect themselves from the risks of environmental degradation. These are people who can choose to migrate elsewhere. These are people who have all the money to shield themselves from harm, which means that if their ultimate goal is to pursue their own individualistic forms of pleasure, if they have the option to insulate themselves from all the negative externalities brought out by their action, they would pursue that and do just that. What are the two extensions I'm going to talk about as second negative? I hope third F responds to this. First, I'll situate this to the context of COVID and explain why the fight against COVID has become significantly harder when people invoke their hedonistic lifestyles. Secondly, I'll talk about institutional discrimination and why these things have likely been able to be fixed precisely because of the stigmatization that we have towards hedonism. Firstly, let's talk about the situation of COVID. Note that in status quo, a lot of individuals choose not to wear masks. People are like, I can't breathe, it's inconvenient. People are like, I want to go to the beach because it's more fun. People are like, I want to hang out with my friends because you know what? YOLO. What happens, ladies and gentlemen, is that pleasure comes at the expense of public health. Note that the reason why this is important for us to understand is because the rationale of these individuals, why they do these types of things, is the belief that their happiness takes primacy over collective good. In status quo, the reason why we're able to check and balance the actions of people that tend to go extreme is because what we do in status quo is to call these individuals out for being Karens. We tell them, no, you cannot enter the store unless you choose to wear a mask. And if you don't do that, you're an entitled person that we need to be able to shame, especially in status quo, that the way for us to deal with COVID necessitates things like social distancing and understanding that maybe things that exist outside that give you pleasure and happiness are things that you probably need to suspend as of the moment and take a backseat in order for us to protect common good. But note that on their side of the house, if they say we build policies, right? We can build policies to ensure that people don't go extreme. Yeah, we build policies and we mandated people to wear masks. We mandated people not to go to mass gatherings, and people lamented that. People went against it and said, we don't like that. This is not the America we know. We ought to follow our individualistic desires. We are free people. So even if you say there are policies on your side, there's a significant amount of backlash that still makes individuals want to opt out from that. So we don't think you're able to fix the issue of COVID on your side. We think probably it's not a perfect world, but we're able to check and balance people that tend to go extreme. Now let's talk about discrimination and why the ability to fix and bridge the gaps in terms of discrimination existed precisely because we chose to stigmatize hedonism. Note that the reason why discrimination has existed for so long is because people in positions of power were unable to see beyond the realities outside themselves. We think that like in the past, this looked like white individuals not willing to give rights to Black people because they think that, well, I don't experience the harms and I probably wouldn't get any benefits if I choose to give you your rights. It also looks like heterosexuals not caring about the suffering of the LGBTs because they think that what's more important is for them to uphold their own beliefs that gay people are bad because that gives them pleasure. How do these things change on our side? When you shame individuals for hedonism and they believe that whatever gives them happiness, whatever gives them pleasure is the most important, you force these individuals to like introspect their beliefs and make some room for necessary sacrifices, which is why on our side, you have heterosexuals willing to listen to gays, you have white individuals willing to listen to Blacks and other immigrant and minorities precisely because they know that the world does not revolve around them, that their beliefs, while it gives them pleasure, is not the most important, that they need to look beyond the self. Upila Spanish 1 is very proud to oppose.
Thank you for that speech. I welcome the third speaker from side affirmative to continue the debate.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Just give me like 10 seconds. I just have to get my timer. All right. Am I audible loud and clear?
Yes, you are.
All right. Three, two, one. Panel, we think they have misunderstood what the motion really is about. they are trying to reject hedonism as they're just trying to reject people who are dicky and selfish to the extent where like other people are harmed. They're literally saying that we have to defend criminals and the choice to become criminals and all those kind of things. We are not talking about that kind of a debate at all. We think laws exist for them, and like they have to justify as to why laws are not enough for you to for you to for you to be restrained in terms of committing crimes, or like say for example indulging in racist pleasure or whatever. We think like people are racist in terms of people are racist not because they get some pleasure out of it. It's because of like prevailing social morality that is already there. We don't understand why hedonism or hedonistic lifestyles are then linked to institutionalized discrimination. We don't think that the person who killed or murdered George Floyd derived any pleasure out of it. That's not the reason for the discrimination. It was because of the prevailing stigma that was there in terms of social morality that was there in terms of why black people don't deserve all those kind of things, right? We think that is the kind of premise behind why discrimination exists on their side, right? Secondly, this idea behind COVID-19, we think that we already tried to debunk this in second affirmative, but let's try to clarify it further, right? We think that you not violating lockdown is also something which is also of a self-preservatory nature. We think, I can also, the very fact that, if I violate lockdown, my own pleasure is something that is denied to me in future, because I know for a fact that I won't be able to go out, go out, because the lockdown is going to continue for far longer than necessary if I violate the lockdown. It's something that makes people, it's something that already exists. People are rational actors. They are not people who are just stupid in terms of just being Karens and just going out and violating lockdown and all those kind of things. We think that lockdown, and the reason why people will still not violate lockdown on our side can also exist on our because of self-preservatory and all this kind of reasons, right? But lastly, their idea as to why you need to have a call out for them, right? Because, and this is the premise of the case, for them to win this debate, they had to justify this really strongly, right? Their case on this was the fact that you need to have a call out for people who are going to to indulge in actions which are going to be far more detrimental to people because of some collective good that they're talking about. We think that corporates, in terms of what Kevin told you, the kind of production that they do is also because of self-preservation, and also because of employment opportunities that they generate for the people, people who are who they are trying to defend in terms of poor people or marginalized people, who also get employment in terms of working in factories and all. We don't understand why that has to also be called out, because the point at which where you have laws against that or have stigma against that to the point where corporations can also not produce or cannot also be given some sort of some sort of freedom to sustain themselves. We don't understand how the marginalized and the poor people are better off on their side, who are getting direct benefits out of this as well in terms of employment. Which we think that all those kind of harms in terms of squirreling away from this debate is something that we regret in this debate. We think this debate is something that is not about objectively bad actions, say for example deriving pleasure out of murdering people. That is not what this debate is about. This debate is not about objectively the sole reason that you're polluting the environment is because, hey, I'm deriving some masochistic pleasure out of it. No, it's because I'm getting some benefit out of it, which is not pleasure. It's something that is in terms of self-sustenance and preservation. That is the reason why those kind of premises exist. But we think that people are still rational in terms of not going ahead and and not going ahead to the extent where you can actually violate somebody's right to the extent of their livelihood or anything as such, because we think penal laws and all those things anyway exist. What is the debate then about if it is not about those kind of hedonistic pleasures that they were trying to squirrel this debate into? This debate is about smaller things, and if we prove to you that these smaller things are also affected, which they say that this debate is not about, we are already winning this debate. Because simple things drinking excessively even though you know that the next morning you'll wake up with a hangover, or what Ira told you in terms of going to a spa, indulging in self-care, taking a break from rigorous work hours in the office, all these kind of things are also parts of hedonistic lifestyles that are also affected by the stigmatization of hedonistic lifestyles. They had to tell you why stigma is only necessary for one particular section of criminal acts, for which we already have checks, which also blanketly harm these kind of pleasures or harm these kind of things which are not exactly harmful to other people, right? I don't understand why me drinking 4 quarters of say for example Old Monk one night is going to affect the collective good in any way possible. So I really don't understand why do you need to have a stigma which prevents me from accessing that lifestyle, which prevents me from going and doing that thing, right? Also, they say that, hey, only rich people can do it, so let's not, it's unfair. I mean, if people can do it, whoever can access it, what is the harm in trying to access it when you're not harming people? We don't understand why that becomes the comparative in this debate. What was the case in which they literally ignored from the beginning, right? our entire point behind why we are trying to regret stigmatization was the fact that it has far more harms than the benefits it causes. Because there are examples in terms of COVID-19, or say for example environmental laws being violated, or governmental action, or say for example migration from environmentally migration for climate refugees, are all things either of ineffective implementation of laws, or because governments have no incentive to cater to them and all those kind of things. We think those kind of things are not in this debate. I don't think regretting stigmatization or having stigmatization is going to affect them anyway, because those things are anyway something which are really bad, and they have penal laws anyway. What we then talk about is what this debate is not about. What this debate is not about for them, in terms of the small benefits, in terms of small things that people want to opt out, people want to opt into, because they think that the current world is far too competitive and fast paced, and they need to indulge in self care at some point of time. This looks like, say for example, when Ira told you stopping by to and drinking coffee in Starbucks, taking a break from your law firm job, where the lifestyle is so hectic that it kind of where you can't even indulge in some breaks, because there's heavy stigma, which means that you're not free to make that choice even, right? I think the freedom of people, in terms of the liberty of people to indulge in those kind of pleasures as well, is something which is hampered when there is stigmatization. Because what stigma does is imposes a narrative that what you're doing is bad and unjustified. I think even things which are justified, say for example taking breaks from your office hours, is also something that is covered by the stigmatization. And if you prove all these things also matter, and their harms are also mitigated by what we by what we try to mitigate, we're already winning this debate. We tell you that our even if they did not engage with our matter, that matter still stands, because we think overconsumption is not in this debate, in terms of the idea that overconsumption directly affects some stakeholders that they talked about. But secondly, what Kevin also talked about, in terms of stopping consumption and stopping individual consumption to the extent where you feel hey, I'm being woke right now and ethical right now, because hey, I care about slaves who are working in those some other country where people are working in factories. I'm not sure why stopping my consumption will actually affect them, because there's so many logical leaps in that argumentation, because there has to be government will in terms of actually redirecting resources and ensuring equality in society and all those kind of things. Why is there an individual obligation then for you to stop your consumption and all those kind of things? Because they have to prove why that can happen on their side. Secondly, we tell you that consumption is not always to the extent, or hedonistic lifestyles are not always to the extent where it's always coming at the cost of others. They never talked about that, which was the primary focus from our side. We think this debate has largely been parallel, where we were the only charitable side which tried to engage with them. How did we engage with them? We told you that all their harms are mitigated because laws exist, because penal laws exist, in terms of how those things are objectively considered bad in society. Because if you cannot really derive pleasure out of murder, and affirmative side has to defend that. We think this debate is then about what are these things which are getting harmed because of this stigma, which for which you don't need any stigma to begin with. We think we are significantly winning this debate on that margin, or on that basis itself. Very, very proud to have taken this debate.
Thank you for that speech. I welcome the third speaker from side negative to continue the debate.
Am I audible?
Hi, yes, you're audible.
All right. It was third affirmative that told us that stigmatization teaches people that these actions are not justified. This is exactly what we've been saying. These particular narratives fuel policies that forces politicians to create actions. Social narratives are a signaling mechanism for laws that tells people that this particular action is unjustified and we have to do something about it. I think it's conflicting, right? Because Third app said that all of the harms that we post can be mitigated by laws. But the question that we have to ask now is, where do laws come from? Laws come from the understanding that some actions are bad and we have to mitigate these things. But if affirmative side tells you that it's fine if you pursue your pleasure over anything else, then we don't have a signaling mechanism that forces people to do something about the problems that we have posed to you in this debate, right? The only solution that they give to us is that laws exist. It's fine even if people become excessive. I'm gonna prove to you that this is gonna be the demise in affirmative side in today's debate. I'm gonna answer two questions. Firstly, I'm gonna solve the deadlock on self-care and hedonism. What's the difference between these two things, and what is the debate that we should be debating on? Secondly, where do we stop exploitation? And lastly, why are excesses bad? Firstly, on self-care and hedonism, I think that affirmative mistake that this is something that they have to actually defend, right? The first mistake that they made is that they misinterpreted hedonism as self-care, right? They thought that hedonism looks like wearing face mask at night after a long day's work or taking a rest after being tired, right? It's not hedonism. Hedonism is like what first negative said. It is the excessive prioritization of own pleasure above anything else. This is a lifestyle that teaches people that if they want to take an action, but it goes against a common good, you have to choose your own pleasure because you're only accountable to yourself. This is selfishness. People are dying from COVID, but you want to go to a pub? Go. You do you because you have to prioritize your pleasure. The world is burning because of climate change, but you want to expand your business because it gives you pleasure? Go. Build your mining company because it will make you happy. Self care is something that we support because it's a human need. We believe that people should rest when they're tired or they should pursue their dream of becoming a YouTuber or artist. We believe that people should take care of themselves so we don't have to get exploited by their bosses. These things shouldn't be debated on, and I don't think that this is a fair debate that they want to pursue. But hedonism is the excessive self care. It's a lifestyle that lets people put their pleasure over anything else. It must be stigmatized. I think that's pretty clear, and they still haven't responded to anything, right? Why is then excessive pleasure bad? What are the forms of pleasure in status quo? These are wealth, happiness, and comfort. And we have repeatedly saying these things, right? These things are good in moderation. But hedonism makes these things so excessive, even if you have to pursue your own self-interest, even if the consequences are so bad for people. We talked about climate, right? Let's now talk about climate and why we ultimately get this sub-issue. The main premise of global warming, like what Farley said, is the depletion of resources that creates disastrous consequences. Hedonism teaches people to put your own pleasure on the top of their priority. That's why businessmen expand their businesses, shave more mountains, dig more lands. That's for your own pleasure. We have to stigmatize these actions because in affirmative's world, when we glorify hedonism, there is a less societal impetus to call out exploitative rich white men because people will just say, you know, it's his pleasure. We can't really attack him. Then second affirmative said, we need policies and protesters to solve these things, right? This is contradictory to what they've been saying. This is exactly what we want. This can only happen when there's a societal consensus that excess is bad. We have to rally. We have to let go of our own pleasure, maybe get shot by rubber bullets sometime because we have to fight for the climate. How do you do this on affirmative side? By saying that pursuing your own pleasure is good? I think it's very contradictory, and there's no mechanization whatsoever on how they force people to go out of their comfort zones and go to protesters or lobby for rights that don't necessarily target them, right? Then they said, and they talked about, you know, people are self-sustaining. They don't want to ruin the environment because they want to sustain themselves, right? I think when you teaches people that they have to pursue pleasure over anything else, they will not stop. They will not say, "Oh, I don't have any money anymore." What they will do is they will pursue more things so that they can get more resources and regain their money so they can spend more excessively. People don't give bat shit about carbon emission. They'd rather ride their cars than commute because they don't want to be bored in a car, right? But second app said, no, people are rational and they want to preserve the environment. How does this happen when you always want to pursue your own pleasure in affirmative side, right? I think if people lose money and they start to feel like they have to get more pleasure, they will always find ways to do this. They will go miles and find ways to achieve pleasure even if it's exploitative, right? I think this is a main reason why there's a lot of company that's able to bribe people, that's able to bypass bureaucracies for them to be able to get wealthier and wealthier. Then the last thing that they said about this is that it's bad to alienate people. We agree. But I think that there's a bigger harm that we have to mitigate, and we only mitigate this through societal consensus that excess is bad and we have to do something about it. So I think on climate, you only solve this when you have a societal consensus that excess is bad. Where do we then stop exploitation, right? Affirmative said that stigmatizing hedonism will force people to never stop working. That's not glorifying work, right? That's literally exploitation. This is their logic. They said that when we stigmatize hedonism, people are forced to work nonstop. I think that's false. When your boss tells you to work nonstop, it's not because he hates pleasure. He forces you to work because he wants to get the most payment, most benefit from you, right? That's your boss prioritizing his own pleasure over the common good. He wants to get richer because that's where he gets pleasure. This is the thing that we will stigmatize. As a society, we have to teach our children and people in power that excessive pursuit of money is always bad, and we have to bind together to be able to fight exploitation. You don't get this in a society that recognizes that it's fine even if you exploit just for you to get pleasure. Lastly, we talked about discrimination and a lot of problems we're facing right now. But the best thing that we got from affirmative is that that's not true. That's not hedonism, right? Pleasure rooted from looking or feeling superior as a race is still pleasure, and it's still hedonism. Where people are fine with discriminating other races because they feel like they have to go to the extents of maximizing their pleasure, right? Look at protests right now, and look at the Black Lives Movement rallies or LGBT rallies. These are people going to the rallies, sacrificing their own comfort, sacrificing their safety to be able to protect people that they don't even know. Look at a lot of white people that are defending a lot of black people, even if that means they get shot by rubber bullets. These are the exact same world that we want to live in. We want people to forgo their own pleasure for the common good. You don't get this in affirmative side, where people believe that they should always prioritize their own good over the society, right? This is the same problem we have in COVID right now, still unresponded to by third affirmative, where people want the comfort and the wealth and the enjoyment of going out over the common good of society's health, right? I think these are the problems that you cannot mitigate unless you stigmatize hedonism and you have a societal consensus that excess is bad. We clearly took this debate. Thanks.
Thank you for that debate. I welcome the reply speech from negative.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, you're audible.
All right, that's great. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Okay. There are two definitions of hedonism in today's debate. One that means self-care on side affirmative, and on our side we said it's not self-care, it's the pursuit of self-pleasure over everything else. Why is our definition significantly better? So we think that on their side, we said it's not about getting facials, it's not about going to spas, it's not about getting a face mask at night. Because these things, ladies and gentlemen, are not stigmatized in society right now. What we would say is people are allowed and are maybe not encouraged, but we allow individuals to do these things because people deserve to rest. What we propose as hedonism is JJ going to the derma in the middle of quarantine, not caring about the possibility of picking COVID along the way and spreading it to his family when he goes home. That, ladies and gentlemen, is what we mean by hedonism. It is the pursuit of individual interest, not caring about the potential externalities that go to other people. Why do we think this is the correct debate, and why do we think that our definition is significantly more believable is because we think, A, this is what happens in status quo and not what they're saying on their side of the house. But even if what we said was you need to be able to compare harms, because the harm of people getting shamed for having a face mask or having a manicure is still significantly less than the harm, ladies and gentlemen, of people like probably not being able to access like food because some people are hoarding it because that gives them pleasure and things like that. How do they mitigate the harms we presented on our side? So they said on their side, we can have loss anyway. Why can't the benefit of loss exist on their side? We were clear that loss can only be created because they are a recognition that an action is bad and ought to be stopped. Note that there was a tension on their side. They said, but these things aren't bad, right? These things ought to be encouraged and not stigmatized. So if you're saying that they are not bad and the harms aren't there, then loss wouldn't be present to be able to fix that. But even if loss can exist on your side, and I said this in my speech, I'm not sure why they didn't respond to it. We think people respond negatively to these laws and protest against it when people are mandated by states to wear masks. People protested and said America is a free country. You shouldn't be forcing us to wear these things. We wouldn't follow these things. So what we would say on our side of the house is you need to be comparative because laws aren't just random magic ones you can wave on your side and say that everything else is fine and dandy. You have to look at how people respond to it. But if your mitigated response exists, saying that saying that you have a law only means that you're able to prevent things that are illegal. We never said we're going to murder and crimes. We said there's so many things that people do that aren't necessarily illegal but have negative externalities. Things like hitting a car instead of because it emits carbon to the environment. Things like hoarding masks and hoarding alcohol and not allowing other people from being able to. What do you do? We're not so sure how you fix it. We said at our that only by shaming these individuals can you be able to tell that you be able to call for all the time check. I don't have a timer. Lastly, I talked about fixing discrimination. I said we need to go beyond the legality that exists within their side. Recognize that
Did he just die?
Was he
Yeah,
dropped?
I don't think I can hear him either.
Yeah, he's not in the Zoom.
All right, we'll contact JJ.
Yeah, please con. Oh no, he's back. Welcome back, JJ.
Hi, JJ, can you hear us?
Yeah, sorry. Was my speech cut?
Yeah.
Yes.
I caught you at
At what part?
3:33.
I'm so sorry. Probably my internet.
Don't worry about it. I caught you at 3:33.
Where did I end?
You have, I guess. I only remember that you ended at 3:33. I was writing it down.
Hello?
So yeah, can you hear me?
At what part did I end?
Would any of the other judges would like to tell them why they ended, because I was also writing down, so I have a different spreadsheet on how I do my replies.
Yeah,
You're
I'm not
talking
entirely sure.
Yeah, you were talking about policy implementation when you ended.
Yeah, you were talking about laws.
Sorry, what part? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
You were talking about how policies are implemented, laws and stuff like that.
Oh.
I had you at
laws.
3:33. Yeah, I have you at 3:33. So you have about 30 seconds, less than 30 seconds till you reach 4. All right.
33 seconds. All right. So I'm just going to continue from that. So we said that the thing about policies is that even if you're able to pass them, people are still going to respond negatively and respond to it with backlash. A lot of people in America responded to mandates on masks negatively and said that these things are against the core values of freedom and they don't want to recognize that these things are good. We didn't just talk about crimes. A lot of things are bad, are allowed and are not illegal but have negative externalities. Riding a car over walking isn't necessarily bad, but as an aggregate, it creates harms to the environment. So we said on our side of the house is on our side, we prevent people from doing these excessive things and not thinking about the harms that exist to other people. For all of those reasons, we think A, we debated the correct debate. Secondly, we engaged the definitions that they have on their side. But lastly, I think we mitigate the harms we presented. They have to prove why they do it on their side.
Thank you so much for that speech. I welcome the affirmative reply.
Hi, I'll be going affirmative reply, the deputy. Just give me 10 seconds. I'll be timing myself. Starting in 3, 2, 1. All that we got from side negative was a classic BP extension on running minorities, which didn't really make sense. Let's analyze what they said. The first question is this really a debate about all the societal problems that they try to fix vis-a-vis climate change and racism, or is this something far more individualistic? Let's make their case a wash right now while being charitable, right? First, they said climate change will go away and will be much better off when you teach people to not prioritize pleasure. But that's untrue. I told you how corporations do and violate all these laws and deprioritize climate change for their self-sustenance because they want to earn more money, because that's linked to their sustenance, not because they enjoy destroying the climate or because they enjoy killing people or overworking people, because they derive self-sustenance out of it. Which means even in their argumentation of how all these problems are solved, the premise remains a wash at best, because even in the presence of stigmatization, companies and corporations will still do the same thing. The second thing that they said in terms of how racism goes away, that's again untrue. We don't think racism existed ever in America because people had fun depriving. Always originated from the fact that people benefit from it monetarily, because that's how it's institutionalized right now, because all the jail system monetize upon this by having free labor forces when they keep criminalizing and incarcerating black individuals. We don't think people just have fun being racist. People also derive self-sustenance of it, which means at best, even if in the world you stigmatize all of these things, these harms still exist because people derive self-sustenance out of it. Which means, are they really solving all the problems that they said by stigmatizing, or are they just running a minority extension like I told you at the start of my speech? Then they said that, pandemic also comes into play because, people just go out because they prioritize self-pleasure. No, we've also told you, even at best, this is a wash, because people don't wear masks because they feel they have trouble breathing. That's their own life. It's not pleasure. And that's something that they mentioned in their own speech, which means even if all the benefits that they told you as of now are at best a wash because they are not really substantiated and not proven exclusive from their side. Because climate change doesn't happen in a world where corporations want to prioritize their self-interest of earning money. Pandemics and all these things don't happen in the point when people feel it's their own self-interest to be able to survive and not want to incarcerate their life. They don't just do it just because they have fun killing other people. And that's where the problem is in terms of the definition. Because hedonism means that you prioritize your pleasure and you don't worry about obligation, that and you prioritize your pleasure and your happiness. They said that hedonism means you prioritize pleasure, especially when it harms other people, and that's necessarily true. Even if that were the case, we told you how if you as an individual are taking moves that harms other individuals, as a society, there's always a consensus on objective good and bad, which means stuff like murdering people, which means stuff like walking out during a pandemic are objectively agreed to be bad, which means irrespective of this stigmatization of hedonistic lifestyles, laws will exist. The only claim they had to this regard is that people will follow laws better when they agree to hedonistic lifestyles. But the problem is that for a person who is being a douche will still think that they are doing all these things and violating laws for self-sustenance and not just for pleasure, because they have fun violating laws, because they want to violate it because it's necessary for them. Which means you can't stop Karens from being Karens, but you can always stop these individuals from going out by having laws in place. Which means I don't think there's an exclusive benefit of really changing the mindset of people when it comes down to violating these things, and they can happen irrespective. Which means they're not really solving the problem of racism, they're not solving the problem of pandemic, people being irresponsible during the pandemic, or solving the problem of climate change. What was this debate about, and what should have come from their side? This debate was about whether or not individuals have the choice to screw capitalistic agendas, to screw profit motives, to screw all these things that are gray area, good and bad, and prioritize themselves, even if it comes at the cost of not being productive in society. They had to speak about things like alcoholism, addiction, and stuff like people always about how there's always a slippery slope. They mentioned that as a premise that hedonism always means that you indulge in this lifestyle at all points of time, which means our clarification in terms of how whether or not this is a slippery slope, which means in our world will people always be doing this at the cost of other people becomes more important. Because the premise was this, that you prioritizing your pleasure always comes at the cost of someone else. That's not necessarily true. We told you how there are always intuitive self-checking mechanisms that prevent you from being a douche. 3 reasons we gave you in this regard. Firstly, obviously, the idea of laws that you mentioned. Secondly, about how human beings are rational, which means their self-sustenance is always important. Which means I won't keep buying designer handbags when I know that it's ruining the environment and I'm going to die anyway. So I don't think that's a claim that can stand from their side. Thirdly, we said there's always a fluidity in the hierarchy of needs, which means right now, if I want to prioritize my pleasure, that doesn't mean that I'll always be wanting to do that. The premises that they relied upon were very shaky. Their premise, firstly, was that this pleasure always comes at the cost of someone else who is very weak or vulnerable. And even if that is the case, we told you how that's inexclusive at best, because you can't stop a Karen from being a Karen. That necessarily means that laws will play their part in either of these worlds. This debate was about whether individuals should have the right to prioritize themselves and prioritize happiness over being productive in society, and they never fought on that grounds. We feel we have taken this debate very, very proud to propose.
Thank you so much for that debate, guys. Well.